She was America's favorite housewife. But behind that warm smile, Audrey Meadows was holding a secret that haunted her for decades. To millions of Americans, she was Alice sharp-tongued, iron-willed, and endlessly patient, the perfect counterbalance to Jackie Gleason's blustering Ralph on The Honeymooners. Together they brought laughter into countless living rooms and became a symbol of television's golden age. But the woman who stood toe-to-toe with the Great One wasn't just playing a role, she was living a quiet battle, one that never made it into the scripts. What the public saw was chemistry, but what they never knew was that every smile Audrey gave came at a cost. Behind the scenes, Audrey was fighting for space in a room ruled by ego. She learned early on that in the male-dominated world of 1950s television, survival didn't come from speaking out, it came from staying silent. And so she wore that silence like armor. While audiences adored their dynamic, Audrey was keeping something buried deep, something that would take decades to surface. Jackie Gleason was unpredictable, volatile, and often unbearable. But to question him, especially in public, was to risk everything. Audrey knew it, and she wasn't about to become another cautionary tale in an industry where women who challenged the system were labeled difficult and discarded. She chose instead to perfect the illusion. To the world, she and Gleason were the perfect team, one thunder, the other steel. But Audrey wasn't just playing Alice Creighton. She was walking a tightrope where every word, every glance, every pause had to be calculated. She had to match Gleason's fire without outshining it, hold her ground without drawing his wrath. Their comedic timing was legendary, but that perfection didn't come from warmth, it came from war. A silent one. And yet Audrey endured. Not because she was weak, but because she was wise. She understood the stakes. She knew that The Honeymooners was bigger than either of them. It was beloved, iconic. It gave ordinary people something to laugh about in a world still recovering from war. She refused to be the reason that illusion shattered, even if it meant quietly sacrificing herself for the myth. So she stayed. She smiled. She said nothing. For years. But silence, no matter how noble, leaves scars. And as time passed, those scars deepened. In private, Audrey began to confide in those closest to her hints of the truth, fragments of pain, the toll of holding everything in, the exhaustion of walking on eggshells every day, the loneliness of protecting a legacy that never truly protected her in return. And yet, beneath the laughs and applause, something darker was simmering, something Audrey never intended to carry for so long. Jackie Gleason didn't want Audrey Meadows, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. From the moment her name came up, Gleason dismissed her with a wave. He had a vision for Alice Creighton, a tough, grounded, working-class woman. And in his mind, Audrey looked far too polished, too refined, too perfect to ever embody that role. To him, she was Park Avenue in pearls, not a Brooklyn housewife with calloused hands and a sharp tongue. But Audrey wasn't just another actress chasing fame. She saw something in The Honeymooners, something enduring, something real, and she wasn't about to let one man's ego stand in her way. Not even if that man was already one of television's most powerful stars. Instead of arguing, she adapted. Instead of pushing back, she strategized. She had herself photographed in a cheap housecoat, makeup stripped off, hair deliberately undone. The photos told a different story, not of a glamorous actress, but of a woman who could go toe-to-toe with Ralph Kramden and hold her ground. When those pictures landed on Jackie Gleason's desk, something shifted. The transformation was undeniable. Audrey didn't just look the part, she became it, and Gleason, to his credit, relented. He gave her the role, but even in that small concession, the power dynamic was established. This would be his show, his rules, his world. Audrey had forced her way in, but she was already learning the cost of stepping into his orbit. From the beginning, it was clear that Jackie Gleason wasn't just the star, he was the machine. He controlled the tone, the pace, the scripts, and the atmosphere. Every joke, every pause, every line of dialogue filtered through his lens. No rewrites happened without his blessing. No direction was final until he approved. It wasn't a set, it was a kingdom, and Jackie was the self-anointed king. And while Audrey had proven her ability to adapt, she would soon find that Gleason's approval came with conditions. Conditions that silenced, subdued, and slowly wore down anyone who dared to challenge his spotlight. Audrey wasn't naive, she saw it clearly from day one. The favoritism, the volatility, the shifting moods that governed every moment on set. But she also saw what The Honeymooners could become. She believed in the work, she knew they had lightning in a bottle. So she played the game. Carefully, deliberately. She brought Alice Creighton to life not by overshadowing Gleason but by anchoring him. Her calm, grounded presence gave shape to his chaos. Her timing sharpened his delivery. But what audiences never realized was that their beloved chemistry was built on imbalance, on Audrey making herself smaller so Gleason's fire could burn uncontested. And still she stayed, not because it was easy, but because walking away would have meant surrendering something much bigger than herself. The role was hers now, but so was the weight of maintaining the illusion. She had entered Jackie Gleason's world on her terms, but from that moment forward she would have to navigate every step carefully. Winning the part was just the beginning. What Audrey didn't realize was how hard the role and the man would be to endure. He was a comedy genius to the world. To those on set, he was a ticking time bomb. Jackie Gleason's larger-than-life persona didn't switch off when the cameras stopped rolling. It followed him into the studio, into rehearsals, into every interaction. He didn't just control the tone of the honeymooners, he controlled the temperature of the room. The moment he walked in, everyone held their breath, directors hesitated, writers whispered, and for Audrey Meadows, the quiet storm at the center of it all, the set became a minefield, every step measured, every word calculated. Gleason refused to rehearse, claiming spontaneity made the show better. But behind that excuse was something more troubling, a refusal to be questioned, to be challenged, to allow vulnerability. Audrey had seen difficult actors before, but this was something else entirely. Gleason's moods weren't just unpredictable, they were dangerous. One moment he'd shower her with praise, the next he'd ignore her completely. He could deliver a compliment so warm it made the crew smile, only to follow it with a cutting insult that left everyone frozen in place. The set wasn't collaborative, it was combative, and Audrey had to survive in it without ever letting the strain show. Her performance had to be seamless, timing flawless, lines sharp, but more importantly, her demeanor had to be unshakable, not just for the audience, but for Jackie. Each day became an emotional gamble. Would Gleason erupt over a missed line? Would he turn cold because of an innocent suggestion? There were no rules, only reactions. Audrey's professionalism became her shield, her silence her strategy. She understood what was at stake, not just for herself but for the entire crew who had to orbit around Gleason's gravity. And yet with every laugh she earned from the audience, there was a cost. Behind her sharp wit and steady eyes there was fear. Behind every joke there was anxiety. She had to be quick, but not too bold, strong but never confrontational. Her very survival depended on walking that line without slipping. And the public had no idea. To them Gleason was a lovable loudmouth, and Audrey was the clever, unwavering wife who always got the last word. But the truth was far more harrowing. Audrey wasn't performing with him, she was enduring him. Each episode that made America laugh was born from a pressure cooker environment, where one wrong look could change everything. No one outside that set could see the toll it took on her, the tight jaw, the constant restraint, the emotional isolation. And yet, she returned day after day, not because it was safe, but because she believed the show mattered, that the laughter was worth the pain, but keeping the peace came at a price, and no amount of applause could silence the weight she carried daily. They looked inseparable on screen, but off-camera, they barely spoke at all. To the millions watching at home, Audrey Meadows and Jackie Gleason were the embodiment of television magic. Their timing was flawless, their exchanges, electric. To fans, their dynamic wasn't just convincing, it felt real, too real. But that's the illusion television so masterfully crafts. The smiles, the laughter, the supposed camaraderie, it was all a facade. Because behind the razor-sharp comebacks and the chemistry that seemed effortless, was a reality far more fractured. Audrey would later reveal, with haunting honesty, it worked because we didn't like each other. And that single sentence shattered decades of belief. The barbed lines exchanged between Alice and Ralph weren't just scripted, they were emotional release. For Audrey, every snappy retort carried a current of truth, a sliver of tension that mirrored what she could never say outright. The tension wasn't manufactured in a writer's room. It existed, lived and breathed between them. Jackie's unpredictable nature demanded that Audrey stay on her toes. Her calm demeanor wasn't just acting, it was survival. And it was that friction, that tightly controlled battle of energies, that gave their performances a pulse the audience could feel through the screen. But what the world applauded as chemistry, Audrey experienced as combat. They didn't laugh together between takes, they didn't share meals or stories after the cameras stopped rolling. Their relationship began and ended with the script. And for Audrey, that emotional distance wasn't just disappointing, it was isolating. The pressure to maintain the illusion became a performance in itself. Each appearance, each interview, each smile had to reinforce the myth that behind the scenes, the cast was as warm and close as their characters. But the truth was far colder. The emotional labor it took to keep up that lie was invisible to the public, but crushing for Audrey. She had to protect the brand, protect Jackie's image, and above all, protect the illusion that The Honeymooners was a beacon of unity and joy. What she couldn't say then was that her greatest scenes were fueled not by affection, but by endurance. Gleason's erratic behavior kept everyone guessing, and Audrey's strength was in turning that unpredictability into authenticity. She became a mirror reflecting back to Jackie the energy he brought, stabilizing the chaos without ever revealing her own. That kind of chemistry wasn't born from connection. It was born from necessity. It was meticulously built, day by day, line by line, under the weight of expectations and fear. But the audience didn't see the exhaustion behind the poise, or the fear behind the sharp-tongued delivery. They saw laughter, not labor. They saw harmony, not hardship. And Audrey, ever the professional, never let them see anything else. Yet the truth was always there, tucked between the lines of every performance, and the longer the show soared in popularity, the more that hidden truth weighed her down. As the show's fame grew, so did the toll, and soon Audrey's private pain would become too much to bear. Audrey Meadows held her truth for as long as she could, but silence has its limits. For years she showed up with perfect timing, unwavering grace, and a smile that convinced the world everything was fine. But beneath the surface, her spirit was fraying. The strain of walking on eggshells around Jackie Gleason, the pressure of pretending their dynamic was anything more than performance, and the unrelenting burden of being the one who held everything together, it was wearing her down. Audrey was admired for her poise, but poise is not peace, and every day she remained silent. She paid the price in sleepless nights, quiet tears, and a growing ache in her chest that wouldn't go away. Her friends noticed it first, the brief silence when Jackie's name came up, the distant look that crossed her face when she was asked about the honeymooners. She still smiled in public, still played the part, but in private, the cracks were showing. She began confiding in family just fragments at first. Stories of tension on set, of days when Gleason wouldn't speak to her, of nights when she questioned if she could do another season without falling apart. She never painted herself as a victim. That wasn't Audrey's style. But those closest to her saw the toll it was taking. Her energy dimmed. Her laughter changed. Something inside her was breaking, slowly and quietly. And still she stayed. Not because she had to, but because CBS couldn't afford to lose her. Executives knew what she meant to the show. They knew the dynamic between Ralph and Alice wasn't replicable. It was lightning in a bottle, and they treated her like the glass keeping it contained. When she expressed doubt, when she hinted at stepping away, they leaned in with pressure, with promises, with polished reassurances. They told her she was irreplaceable, that viewers loved her, that she was part of television history. But they never asked her how she was holding up. They never questioned what it took for her to keep smiling. The applause drowned out the warning signs. There was no support system for a woman in her position, no safe space to voice concerns. The culture of the time didn't allow for that. A woman who complained was difficult. A woman who pushed back was disposable. Audrey understood the rules, and so she followed them. Her silence wasn't a weakness. It was a strategy. It was the only way to survive in a world where speaking the truth could end a career overnight. She had built a legacy on control, on professionalism, on grace under pressure. But legacies built in silence come with a hidden cost. And for Audrey, the cost was her own voice. Her truth was buried beneath layers of performance, of expectation, of fear. She became a master of hiding the pain, even from herself. But the weight never went away. It just settled deeper, and one day it would reach the surface. One day she would decide that protecting the myth was no longer worth losing herself. But years later, when the applause faded, and the fear lost its grip, Audrey would finally say what she never dated before. She didn't scream. She whispered, and the world finally listened. At 73 years old, long after the cameras stopped rolling and the curtain had fallen on the honeymooners, Audrey Meadows found the courage and the peace to finally tell her side of the story. It didn't come in the form of explosive headlines or revenge-fueled exposés. It came gently, through candid interviews, handwritten letters, and a memoir that revealed more between the lines than it did on the page. For the first time, Audrey spoke not as Alice Craden, not as the composed professional holding it all together, but as a woman who had endured in silence for decades. She described Jackie Gleason, the way only someone who had stood in his shadow could. As a genius, yes, but also as a tyrant. He was magnetic on stage, intoxicating to audiences, and nearly impossible to challenge without consequence. To fans, he was the great one. But to Audrey, he was a man whose brilliance often masked cruelty. The emotional whiplash he caused on set was as exhausting as it was destabilizing. One day, he would compliment her performance with surprising warmth. The next, he'd cut her down in front of the entire crew. For Audrey, the applause never drowned out the sting of that inconsistency. It lingered, festering in the silence she was forced to keep. The years she spent holding back took a toll she rarely acknowledged. Suppressing the truth became second nature. But the weight of it never truly disappeared. In the stillness of later life, when the cameras were gone and the pressure lifted, she began to unpack what those years had done to her. The trauma didn't come from one outburst or a single cruel word. It came from the accumulation, the constant vigilance. The daily performance extended well beyond the soundstage. She had spent a lifetime protecting someone else's legacy. Now for the first time, she was protecting her own. And when she finally spoke, she did so with striking clarity. She didn't lash out, she didn't tear Jackie apart. Instead, she painted a picture of complexity. A man who could be both inspiring and unbearable, brilliant and brutal. Her words reshaped how the public viewed the honeymooners. What was once seen as effortless comedic magic was now understood as the product of relentless emotional balancing. People began to see the cracks in the perfection, the cost behind the chemistry. And for the first time, they saw Audrey Meadows not just as a character, but as a woman who bore more than anyone ever realized. Her truth didn't seek to destroy, it sought to be corrected. She gave voice to the quiet suffering that so many had endured, but never spoken of. She turned whispers into testimony. And in doing so, she reclaimed a narrative that had never truly belonged to her. But there was more she needed to say about the show, the legacy, and the price of keeping quiet. Millions adored the show, but none saw the toll it took to keep that machine running. The Honeymooners wasn't just a sitcom, it was a phenomenon, a cultural cornerstone, the kind of lightning-in-a-bottle creation that television executives dream about. But behind the laughter, behind the perfectly timed punchlines and unforgettable one-liners, was a production held together by silence, tension, and sacrifice. And at the center of it all stood Audrey Meadows, steady, composed, and constantly walking the invisible line between brilliance and breakdown. The myth was that The Honeymooners was a joyful collaboration. The truth was far more sinister. Jackie Gleason ran the show like a fiefdom. Every script, every blocking note, every creative decision flowed through him. Writers didn't suggest they submit. Directors didn't direct, they adjusted. And the cast? They navigated his moods like sailors charting a storm. Audrey, as his on-screen wife, didn't have the luxury of distance. She had to match his volcanic presence without triggering his insecurities. Her lines had to land, but never outshone him. Her reactions had to be sharp, but never too sharp. She was expected to embody strength, but only within the confines of his approval. The energy between them wasn't nurtured, it was extracted from her. Everyone around Gleason adjusted themselves, but Audrey endured him daily. She became the show's quiet backbone, the one who kept the scenes grounded while Gleason raged, improvised, or ignored direction altogether. The emotional weight of this balancing act was immense. There was no venting to producers, no complaints filed to HR. This was the 1950s, and actresses weren't protected, they were replaced. And Audrey knew it, so she buried her exhaustion, swallowed her fear, and delivered performance after performance with such skill that no one ever questioned the cost. But make no mistake, that cost was high. Her sacrifice wasn't a one-time act of professionalism. It was a daily offering, a relentless, silent contribution to a show that millions loved, even as it drained her of joy behind the scenes. She carried not just her own weight, but the emotional burden of a man too powerful to be challenged. While the world laughed, Audrey held steady, her pain neatly tucked beneath every sarcastic quip and icy glare. She made the chaos palatable. She made Gleason's explosions seem harmless. She helped create a world audiences wanted to live in at the expense of the one she was trapped inside. And yet the audience never knew. They saw only the magic, never the machinery. They believed in the myth, that Jackie and Audrey were a perfect comedic pair, that The Honeymooners was a joyful triumph of teamwork and talent. But the truth was, it was Audrey's quiet resilience that made the magic possible. She held it all together, even when everything behind the scenes threatened to fall apart. As the myth flourished, Audrey kept steady, but the scars were real, and some would never fully heal. When Jackie died, Audrey showed up in silence, but that silence said everything. On June 24, 1987, mourners filed into the Cathedral of St. Patrick to celebrate the Great One. Yet all eyes drifted to the woman who had sparred with him on-screen and suffered him off-screen. She stood near the back, head bowed, offering no statements, granting no interviews, refusing the networks their soundbite. To reporters it looked like quiet respect. To those who knew the history, it was something deeper, a private reckoning too complex for cameras. Later, when a close friend asked why she came at all, Audrey answered with just 7 words, soft but unshakable. "I forgave him, but I never forgot." Forgiveness didn't erase the sleepless nights, the whispered doubts, or the wounds time never fully closed. It simply freed her from the anger that once kept her company. In the months after the funeral, talk show hosts begged for an exclusive, tabloids dangled six-figure deals for a tell-all. Audrey refused every offer that demanded venom. Instead, she granted a handful of late-life interviews on her own terms, measured, candid, and unsensational. She called Jackie a once-in-a-generation talent, then without blinking acknowledged that his genius often came wrapped in cruelty. She would praise his timing, then note the terror that timing could trigger backstage. Viewers expecting revenge were startled by her grace, but those listening closely heard the cost embedded in each pause. Because the truth was this: playing Alice Creighton had given Audrey immortality, but it had stolen her peace of mind. The role that made her a household name demanded she swallow her pride, her fear, her voice. Even decades later, memories of unpredictable rage still flickered at the edges of her thoughts, proof that trauma doesn't obey the calendar. Yet she refused to let bitterness define her twilight years. She spent her time mentoring young actresses, urging them to protect their boundaries, to speak up in ways she never could. Talent should inspire, she told one protégé, not intimidate. That balance, honoring Jackie's undeniable brilliance while refusing to excuse his brutality, became her quiet mission. In interviews, she would lean forward, lower her voice, and remind audiences that entertainment's brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows. It was a warning and a confession at once, a reminder that legends are human, and that glamour can hide damage. Her candor reshaped public memory of the honeymooners, adding nuance where nostalgia once smoothed every edge. Fans learned to see the show's perfection as something forged in tension, carried by a woman strong enough to stand in the blast zone and still deliver a laugh. After decades of silence, Audrey Meadows took center stage not as a character, but as herself. No longer the foil to Jackie Gleason's chaos, no longer the silent backbone of a myth. She emerged in her own right, clear, deliberate, and finally unburdened. Her confession wasn't sharp or vindictive. It didn't seek to demolish a legend. It sought something far more difficult: balance. She didn't want pity. She didn't crave applause. What she wanted, what she earned, was the space to be heard without distortion, to be remembered not just for what she played, but for what she survived. Audrey's truth landed with quiet force. She didn't just speak for herself, she gave voice to an entire generation of women who had been dismissed, silenced, or written out of their own stories. Her story echoed through studios, into dressing rooms, onto stages where actresses still tiptoed around egos and temperaments. What once felt personal now revealed itself as universal. And for those women, Audrey became something greater than a sitcom icon. She became proof that even the quietest voices carry power, that endurance isn't invisibility, and silence isn't surrender. Her timing was no accident. The world had changed, audiences had changed. What had once been brushed off as difficult behavior was now called what it truly was: abuse, control, manipulation. And finally, people were ready to hear it. As networks re-aired old episodes of The Honeymooners, viewers looked closer. They listened differently. They saw the tension behind the laughter, the restraint behind every smirk, and they understood what it meant that Audrey had stayed all those years, not because it was easy, but because she refused to let anyone else write her out of history. In the end, her legacy was not just her poise or her performance, it was her endurance, her refusal to let the spotlight blind her to the truth, her ability to carry pain without letting it consume her. And when she finally spoke, she did so not to tear down, but to correct, to illuminate, to breathe her own life into a story that had too long belonged to someone else. What she revealed didn't erase the brilliance of the show. It deepened it. Give it weight, give it the truth, because the audience deserved to know, not just who Audrey Meadows was, but what she endured to become her. And in that act of revelation, she became something far more powerful than a sitcom legend. She became a symbol of strength, hidden in plain sight. A woman who waited patiently for her moment, and when it came, used it to lift others with her. Because behind every great performance is a truth waiting to be told, and Audrey's truth gave her the final word she always deserved. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.